Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time. Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Binus, and I'm joined today by
Jonathan Edens. I'm a psychiatric PA.
And today we're going to be talking about something that I think is really important. On a previous podcast, we did discuss the pros and cons of supplements and how they can actually be effective and helpful oftentimes, but there are also things that we need to watch out for. And, you know, as we've you and I have navigated through this supplement space and trying to wrestle with how to best help our patients, we've discovered some things along the way, right? Yeah. And, one of those things is that, hey, there are definitely a lot of helpful things out there that can actually minimize medications, but there was also some frustration too, because trying to figure out how to make it easy for patients to actually have access to those things and take them in an effective manner. And so maybe you can speak to that a little bit yourself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know when we first kind of started having a conversation about supplements, a couple of years back, we ended up developing a website where we gave some more information about that and dosage and where to find it and stuff like that. And part of the frustration kind of around that whole experience was, as Dr. Binus alluded to, that there were things that were potentially very effective for people to use, but in looking at the market and trying to balance between efficacy, quality, expense, right, and accessibility, right, being able to get that supplement easy, there was usually always some sort of barrier, enough to where a lot of times I would make recommendations to patients, and one of those things was getting in the way. And they would take the prescription medication I would give them, but then I'd strongly recommend and urge them to take something, a supplement in conjunction with that. And I found that, like 75-80% of the time they wouldn't do it. And so we wanted to maybe come up with a new approach, a better approach that we felt like we could accomplish all of those things and increase the likelihood that patients would actually take something that was also going to be helpful for them.
That's right. Because we've personally seen such big benefits when people actually do put those things together, the different combinations, and they know how to get the accessibility and the expense manageable for their budget. We said, you know what, let's go ahead and try to do this on our own. And so we got in the lab and we started doing some research and we really started looking at, okay, what would be an ideal supplement? What would that actually look like? And we said, you know what, when we're thinking about a supplement, let's start with anxiety, right? Because that is just something that a lot of people deal with. It's something that is a big need. And we really didn't find much out there that was really good for helping people. And so we actually came up with our own supplements and started our own supplement company. And I just want to show our viewers that are actually watching this on video. So it is Beautiful Minds Labs, and the name of the product, our first product, is Mindful Relaxation. So hopefully you can see that on the video, Mindful Relaxation. And we're going to spend a little time today talking about the ingredients and why we selected the ingredients that we actually selected. And there is really good reasons why we selected each one of those. And there's a couple things that I want to mention. First of all, I've had quite a few patients actually try this, and not just patients, but acquaintances. And I've had really positive feedback. I mean, a lot of good success. And so that's nice to see that. Another thing that I want to mention before we dive into what the ingredients are is one of the most important aspects of proper supplementation is having the right amount. And so that was really important to us. It's not just what ingredients are in there, but is there an effective dose that will actually help the symptoms that we're targeting?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's one of the primary, I guess I should say, goals behind our particular company was finding the most effective ingredients and combining that into a specific formula, but also using clinically relevant doses, right? And that was one of the frustrations that I found with a lot of those other formulas out there, is that they would mash them, stuff them full with a variety of different things, but all of them were subclinical dose. So maybe they might use like a tenth of the dose that was actually shown in the studies to be effective, but because the name was in there and they counted on people's ignorance or people's lack of knowledge about supplementation, they weren't optimal in my opinion. So we're gonna walk through it sort of in ascending order. Our least I should say all the ingredients of the mindful relaxation powder, and go from the ingredients that are maybe a little bit more kind of take it or leave it, and then all the way to the best ingredients in there, and why we chose each one.
So let's talk about the first one. So the first one is taurine. So what does taurine do? That's something I think they put in Red Bull, right?
Yeah, this is true. Yeah, taurine is that's the most, or I should say, that's an easily recognizable supplement, as you said, because it's in a lot of energy drinks, and so it does a few different things. For the sake of our ingredients, all of these, big surprise, they do help with anxiety to some extent, but taurine can do a few other things. It is an amino acid, however, it's not. Amino acids are the building blocks of protein. However, taurine is not involved in the makeup of what we call protein synthesis. It can help with things like cardiovascular function and development of the brain, the retina, which is a part of the eye, and our muscle. It is also being studied currently, and there's some pretty good research looking at its role in basically sugar metabolism for patients with diabetes or insulin resistance. So, but specifically, we want to look at a couple studies in which taurine was used to sort of study mental health disorders, specifically anxiety. So, does taurine help with anxiety, depression, or other mental health disorders? The jury's still kind of out on taurine. I don't think there's really enough research necessarily to justify using taurine in isolation. And so we'll kind of talk about just a couple of those studies. Did you want to maybe mention anything or talk about the first study?
Yeah. I mean, some of the main studies that we see are more related to animal studies, and we can't always say that that's applicable to humans, but they're oftentimes that's a first step in showing. And a lot of people think like, yeah, taurine does kind of seem to help me a bit. But yeah, for example, taurine was actually given to mice 60 minutes before a certain anxiety test, and they were able to outperform the reference drug thiopental, which is actually a short-acting barbiturate, which is definitely known to calm humans as well as animals. But it was less effective than midazolam, which is a benzodiazepine, which is also a medication that we use for calming. So again,
interesting.
Yeah,
right?
Interesting.
Especially when they take supplements and they compare them to well-known medications that are used for that same purpose. In this case with rats, as we said, not humans. So, you can only gather so much information from that. But but the fact that it was able to outperform a barbiturate was somewhat impressive in that particular study. In another study, they actually gave intranasal taurine once again to mice, and this also had an anti-anxiety effect as well in them. So it was intranasal. Does that change sort of?
It must have done something if their anxiety came down after they got something squirted in their nose.
That's a really good point. And then another study done in rats. Now this was specifically in rats that had been induced with diabetes, right? So they gave them diabetes over time, and then they gave them taurine as a response to that, and it did have an antidepressant effect on the rats that were treated with the taurine relative to the ones that were not. So there definitely does seem to be, at least in rats, a good a potential positive effect from a mental health standpoint. And there is a proposed mechanism for this. It sort of depends on what you're looking at. When you're looking at it for anxiety, right now, I think the leading hypothesis is that it influences glycine, which is essentially another amino acid. And the receptor, when glycine is bound, can have somewhat of a calming effect. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes when we get to magnesium glycinate. But it may also influence the GABA receptor to some extent, and that may be in part if what's helping with the anxiety and the antidepressant benefit.
With it not being 100% clear, less clear than the other ones, why did we still decide to include it in our formula?
And that's a really good question. The fact is, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that a lot of people, do find benefit with taurine. I mean, the fact that it's included in a lot of the energy drinks, there is a reason for that. One, because it's relatively inexpensive, it dissolves. It's also very flavorless, and so it can have a little bit of the taking the edge off of the caffeine effect that you get. And so, most people, when they're anxious, they're overly stimulated, right? Just like somewhat of the effect that you get from taking too much caffeine. And so, a little bit of taurine, especially when used with some other supplements that we're going to talk about, I felt fairly strongly that there would be a synergistic effect, while not really being any, while not worsening the overall tolerability of the supplement, and not really being an expensive addition that's going to drive the cost of the supplement up.
Yeah, and the risk of any issues with taurine is negligible.
So minimal, negligible.
And so really, it's like it probably could help a little bit. So why not include a little bit in our formula?
Right. And so on its own, we really don't recommend taurine generally. I don't think I've ever recommended taurine, to take just in isolation. Right. But so overall, like when it comes to anxiety or just sort of mental health, like I would give it, on a scale of A to F, I'd give it some like a C. It's not,
at least it's not failing.
Yeah, it's not failing. It's not a great supplement. There's other things that I think it's more beneficial for. So, specifically like the diabetes, and we'll talk a little bit about that when it gets to inositol as well. So there are a couple ingredients in here that could be really good as well for specifically patients with anxiety and diabetes simultaneously. So you get kind of a dual action there. So moving on to the next one, our next supplement that we wanted to discuss is GABA. Now that's GABA. So why don't you talk about GABA and tell us what it is, Dr. Binus?
Yeah, so GABA is actually the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in our brain. And so what that means is it actually helps the nerve cells to decrease their activity level. So it does that by creating a chloride influx into the nerve cells, and then the nerve cells actually just calm down. And actually the main anxiety medications that are famous, like Valium and Xanax and Ativan and Klonopin, those all work on the GABA receptor. They stimulate that receptor, they overstimulate that receptor, and then the whole brain just tends to calm down. So giving GABA actually can, in some studies, help stimulate that receptor and in turn calm down the brain.
So, GABA, so medications that influence the GABA receptor in the brain, like you mentioned, Valium and Xanax, even alcohol to some extent, right? Mm-hmm. These things can be very inhibitory. And what I mean by that, they can be very relaxing, right? But these medications bind to that receptor very strongly. And then they also can bypass the brain's natural regulatory system for GABA, because the brain, is going to have its own, very tight regulations about whether or not it lets certain things into pass basically the blood-brain barrier into the brain. And so GABA as a supplement, when you take it orally, because of that tight regulation, the evidence is a little bit mixed as to whether or not it actually makes it into the brain and can have that therapeutic effect that we're looking for.
Absolutely. But there are some studies, are there not, that actually show some positive benefit of GABA. And I was just thinking as you were talking, it might be interesting. I wonder if some of the GABA effect that actually calms people is because of maybe the effect that it could even have peripherally. In other words, in the gut, because we have like the gut brain connection.
Sure.
And who knows, maybe that's part of the effect. I'm guessing maybe some of the GABA gets into the brain, but nonetheless, any way you cut it, it does seem like GABA can often help decrease anxiety for people.
And I think theoretically, hypothetically, if a patient is GABA deficient, kind of like if you're deficient in any sort of vitamin or mineral, if you're GABA deficient, then because of that brain regulation system, like it's probably going to allow more in. So if you tend to be an anxious person, there's that theory that maybe you are to some extent GABA deficient. And so you might be more prone to actually utilize, be somebody that benefits more from GABA supplementation. But that's going to depend somewhat on your unique physiology.
So any studies that you'd want to comment on there as far as the GABA is concerned?
One that I thought was pretty interesting, and this is somewhat of a fault of GABA supplementation studies, is that a lot of them are used in combination with other supplements. So in this particular study, they used a combination of GABA with L-Theanine, and that combination was able to outperform either the GABA or the L-Theanine alone. And this was in basically a sleep latency test. So that means how long it takes you to fall asleep. That study was done in mice. So once again, not a human study, so not the best, but still kind of an interesting study. L-Theanine, which we'll talk about, it can be very effective, but the fact that when they combined it with GABA, it was even more effective, that's definitely encouraging. Overall, though, there was a systematic review, and this included 14 studies on GABA that met the inclusion criteria. And basically, their conclusion was, although more studies are needed before any inferences can be made about the efficacy of GABA consumption on sleep and stress, results did show that there is limited evidence for stress and very limited evidence for the sleep benefits of oral GABA intake. So, with all that being said, once again, do we recommend supplementing with GABA, and why did we include it in our product?
Well, again, I think it goes back to some early research showing that it probably could be helpful, at least in some individuals, and a lot of anecdotal evidence. A lot of people swear this stuff really helps. It's amazing.
Go to just about any GABA product on, say, Amazon, and you'll have people in there, all up and down, right, writing very raving positive reviews about taking GABA and feeling like it was helpful.
And like we talked, even with the taurine, there's that synergistic effect that it seems to boost the impact of some of the other supplements that we've included. So overall supplement score, what would you say, Jonathan?
I would give GABA on its own a B-. So I think we're moving more towards supplements that are going to be going to get higher scores. So I definitely think it has its place. I think it's better than taurine overall, especially when used in combination. So once again, I very rarely ever recommend GABA on its own, but specifically when combined with other anxiolytic supplements, I think it can be more effective than in isolation.
All right. Well, I think you're the kind of person that has never been satisfied with a B-. So let's move on to our next one. And our next one is magnesium glycinate. And how do you say that? Glycinate or glycinate?
I say glycinate, so I'm going to keep saying glycinate. But magnesium glycinate, or magnesium in this case, it is an essential dietary mineral. I think most people have heard of magnesium, in part because it's one of the most prevalent deficiencies in the United States. Frequently it's cited as the second or third most common deficiency. And so maintaining healthy magnesium is protective against so many things. But particularly there's been a lot of research on depression and ADHD and anxiety disorders for magnesium. So it is definitely a worthwhile supplement to be talking about.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm even thinking from a cardiovascular perspective, it's very important for the heart to function properly. And one of the interesting caveats that I've learned over the years with mental health is what is important for the heart is also important for the brain too. And magnesium is no exception to that. So I think magnesium is just one of those critical elements because it's involved in so many different things in the body, including being a cofactor for various chemical processes in the body, and so it's really important thing for us to make sure we have adequate stores.
The first study that we're going to look at with magnesium. This was magnesium in major depression. And in this particular study, the authors concluded, they said, "We believe that when taken together, there is more than sufficient evidence to implicate inadequate dietary magnesium as contributing to the cause of major depression. And we suggest that physicians prescribe magnesium for its prevention and treatment."
I mean, I think that's a pretty bold statement, actually.
I think so too. I mean, basically it was like a blanket statement that, we should really be considering magnesium for most of our depressed patients.
Yeah. And to me, it just makes sense as far as it's not going to hurt, right, to take some extra magnesium. So if you're struggling with any kind of mental health issue, whether it's depression or anxiety or anything else for that matter, magnesium, I think, is a good thing to definitely try.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we should comment on why it's so commonly deficient. Basically, the soil here in America with most of our produce is deficient in a lot of nutrients, magnesium in particular. And so if you wanted to, say, get magnesium only from your diet, you'd have to be very strategic in how you did it. And so, for most people, even if they eat a really healthy diet, they're probably still somewhat deficient in magnesium. And so supplementation can be very beneficial for, as we said, a variety of different things. The second study, this was a systematic review, right? So basically it's just a collection of multiple different studies. This one, it was 18 studies, and where they looked at magnesium specifically for anxiety. And they found, and I quote, that the evidence was suggestive of a beneficial effect of magnesium on subjective anxiety in anxiety vulnerable samples.
And again, I think that just helps us to really see that magnesium is going to be helpful not only for the depressive side, but oftentimes for the anxiety side of things too. Now, when we're talking about magnesium glycinate or glycinate, why did we choose? Because there's a lot of forms of magnesium. There's magnesium citrate, there's magnesium malate, threonate, there's oxide. So there's a lot of different magnesium. Why did we choose glycinate?
The reason we decided to go with this particular form of magnesium is kind of twofold. Actually, it's threefold. The first is that magnesium glycinate is one of the best absorbable forms of magnesium. And so, a lot of kind of subpar forms of magnesium, you're not going to absorb very well. And so even if the bottle says like there's this elemental magnesium in it, if it's bound to, a particular basically ingredient like malate or oxide or citrate, your body isn't going to be able to pull the magnesium away from that quite as well. So you actually get the elemental magnesium. So magnesium glycinate, it dissociates very well, in the body. So you're going to get basically you're going to get almost full absorption of it. And so that's the first aspect of it. The second one is that because of that absorption and because of the glycinate being generally very tolerable as well, you generally don't get a lot of the digestive issues that you tend to get with a lot of the other forms of magnesium. So, oxide tends to cause a lot of bloating, a lot of digestive issues. Citrate tends to cause a lot of diarrhea, right? And so
that's why we use it as a laxative,
for constipation, exactly. So it can be very, very effective in that particular way, but it may not be the best option, if you're wanting to take something regularly and you don't have any sort of regular constipation. So the glycine, though, the third reason is that glycine is sort of a dual purpose molecule, right? It's another amino acid, but it can have some positive effects for anxiety and sleep. And so there is a study that specifically looked at glycine and its ability to improve sleep onset, as well as subjective sleep quality and next day fatigue. And so, when you take magnesium glycinate in comparison to some of the other forms, you're basically getting a 2-for-1. You're getting two things that can help you feel more relaxed, simultaneously.
Sounds like a great synergistic combination there. And I'm excited to have this in our formula. And I think it's, why did we include it? It's kind of a no-brainer, I think. Why wouldn't we include it is maybe a better question. And what would your grade be?
I would give magnesium glycinate a B+. So I think it's a really good supplement. I almost gave it an A-.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think I'm a little more forgiving. I think I would lean towards A-.
I think you're probably right. We could definitely give it an A. The reason why I was more so thinking about it, in general for anxiety, the effects of magnesium, even though it's extremely helpful for so many different things. And I really think most people should be taking magnesium. When it comes to anxiety, based on the research in general, the positive effects are relatively mild. They can definitely be, significant for certain individuals, but especially if you're magnesium deficient. But just in a general sense, it's probably not the most effective isolated
by itself
by
for
itself, right?
anxiety,
So
right.
so it was more so that was the reason why I gave it more of a B plus. So a great supplement, most people should take it, very well tolerated. However, if you're just purely taking it for anxiety, it may not be your first go-to.
So what's our next supplement that we're going to talk about?
The next one is frequently I get kind of a sideways look when I mention this one because most people haven't heard of it, but it's Inositol, also known as Myoinositol sometimes. So Dr. Binus, why don't you tell us a little bit about Inositol?
Sure. So inositol, some people actually call it a B vitamin, vitamin B8, but it's not technically a B vitamin. It's actually an isomer of glucose. So it's actually kind of considered a pseudo vitamin, if you will. And the way that inositol actually helps, it seems, is that it enhances the activity of serotonin at the receptor site. So it basically kind of makes the effect of serotonin more effective. And many of our listeners probably know that serotonin and serotonergic medications are often used for anxiety. It also seems to have some dopamine effect, which helps with an overall enhancing mood. And that's what we kind of see with inositol, is that it actually helps quite a bit, especially if people are taking it on a regular basis. With anxiety, but then I've also noticed for a lot of people that it seems like it helps their mood as well.
Inositol it's a natural substance. So, if you're eating a healthy diet, you're probably getting a little bit of inositol, particularly in things like whole grains and citrus fruits. But generally speaking, even if you're eating a lot of those foods, you may only be getting like maximum up to a gram per day. And, as we'll talk about, some of these studies used up to like 18 grams, particularly for panic attacks, before they really found where they found the most benefit, essentially. However, though, inositol, while it definitely does a lot in the brain, it also does a lot elsewhere as well. And so that's one of the exciting things about inositol, is that it just it seems to be able to help so many different things. Specifically, there's been studies that have looked at inositol deficiencies, and they found that it was common in patients like those with type 2 diabetes, those with gestational diabetes, and those with polycystic ovarian syndrome. And so particularly in like women with polycystic ovarian syndrome, it was able to boost fertility. I mean, it's also been shown to be able to reduce PMS symptoms, as well as even things like binge eating, bulimia, and OCD, it did have a positive effect on. But for the sake of this discussion, we really want to focus mainly on its effect for anxiety. So, Dr. Binus, why don't we walk through a couple studies with inositol? I'll go ahead and cover the first one, because this one really excites me. When I found this study initially, we generally don't tend to get a lot of double blind crossover trials,
right, especially with supplements, right?
Yeah, right. We also don't get a lot of placebo controlled trials a lot of times with supplements. But in this first study, they basically did a comparison of inositol to fluvoxamine, which also known as Luvox, which has gained a lot of popularity recently because of COVID and its ability to potentially treat that. However, not going to go into that. But inositol, in comparison to Luvox, which is well known for reducing anxiety, this was studied particularly in patients with panic disorder, in which they were having multiple panic attacks on a weekly basis. And so, on average, the inositol reduced the number of panic attacks per week by 4, whereas the Luvox, the antidepressant medication, only reduced them by 2.4 attacks per week. Right. So there was inositol was almost double, right? Almost more double in its effect relative to the Luvox at reducing the frequency of panic attacks on a weekly basis, while also being far better tolerated.
And to me, that really is remarkable, because again, fluvoxamine, Luvox, is a commonly used FDA approved medication to treat panic disorder and other anxiety disorders. And yet here's just a piddly supplement that's actually outperforming it when it comes to panic attacks. And so I think that's pretty exciting. Another study, now this one was also a double-blind study and a placebo-controlled trial. And again, these are actually pretty good studies, because that's how antidepressants are actually even studied, right? They do the double blind, the placebo controlled. Inositol outperformed placebo in managing symptoms of panic attacks as a result of agoraphobia. And so that's another exciting result, I think.
Yeah. And for those who don't know, Dr. Binus, do you want to define agoraphobia real quick?
Yeah, so agoraphobia is the sense of this fear of going outside of your house. Oftentimes, it basically just you end up very withdrawn. You're like in a bubble, and you have this panic of even leaving your house.
The last study that we'll talk about with inositol, it was a small trial with bipolar patients who were suffering from depression, and inositol was able to outperform placebo in alleviating those depressive symptoms. Now, we're not necessarily saying that if you have bipolar depression, you should be taking inositol, but this study, along with many others that were used specifically for depressive symptoms, inositol was able to have a mild to modest effect in many of those trials.
Absolutely. And I've read other studies, and this is generally where they use very high dose inositol, that it can also be effective for OCD as well.
Mm-hmm.
Usually for OCD, they're dosing it at 6 grams 3 times a day, so 18 grams a day, which is a huge amount. But there were significant positive effects for quite a few patients that have OCD. And this isn't going to be overnight. The effects of inositol in both my clinical experience and also in the studies, it takes some time to usually have effect. I mean, how long would you say, generally speaking, you've noticed that it usually takes for it to have that positive effect?
It really depends on the patient and how long they're able to get up to, how long it takes them before they're able to get up to, like a maximum dose. However, in the studies that we referenced, particularly the panic attack studies, these were only 4-week trials. And so, it was able to reduce, as I said, by the first study, by 4 panic attacks per week in only 4 weeks. So that's actually pretty quick, relatively speaking, because a lot of our antidepressants, you may not even get to full maximum effect after the 4 weeks. So, actually in timing, I do say, generally around 4 to 8 weeks, for the inositol, kind of depending on your ability to get up to that dose that you need to.
Absolutely. And the one thing that's nice about inositol too, it does have a fuller effect after several weeks. But I have noticed for a lot of people, there's even a relative immediate effect, at least somewhat, maybe not as pronounced, but there definitely is a more immediate calming effect. Whereas, some of the antidepressants, oftentimes the more immediate effect is initially more agitation. So that's also, I think, a benefit when we're comparing to, well, should I try an antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication first or inositol? It's like, I think in my mind, it's kind of a no-brainer. I would first try the inositol because minimal side effect potential and pretty large benefit potential.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's why we give it what?
We give it an A-. The reason I give it an A- versus say like an A or an A+ is really that side effect of indigestion and diarrhea. And it doesn't happen in everybody. But it is definitely more common than than it was shown to be in placebo in those trials. And so, I've had some patients that weren't able to tolerate inositol because of the diarrhea. And so that's just one thing that you need to be aware of. However, that is also very common, with antidepressants. And just like with antidepressants, generally your body does get accustomed to it over time. And so especially if you're sensitive to that side effect, starting at a lower dose and just increasing the dose, maybe a little bit more slowly over time before you can get to a dose that's going to be effective for you.
Absolutely. All right. So we made it to our last one.
What
is our last one?
Yeah, our last supplement we're going to talk about today, and the final ingredient in mindful relaxation is L-Theanine. So Dr. Binus, what is L-Theanine?
Well, L-Theanine is a non-essential amino acid that really helps relax the brain, but it doesn't cause the typical sedation that a lot of other products, whether it's medications or maybe even supplements, can cause when we talk about relaxing the brain. And I think that's a really positive thing. It seems like it helps to mildly boost neurotransmitters like GABA, serotonin, dopamine, and some evidence shows that it actually helps to enhance some of the alpha wave activity in the brain, which can help kind of this relaxed state, but while at the same time still being alert.
Yeah, absolutely. Frequently, it's actually used as what we call a nootropics or a cognitive enhancing supplement. Something that can even enhance focus to some degree while being simultaneously relaxing. Right.
Yeah.
Which is a really unique property.
Absolutely. And I'll say this, when I prescribe a stimulant to somebody who has ADHD and really needs like some Ritalin or Adderall or something like that, especially if they're having a little bit of agitation or anxiety with it, just having them take it with a little bit of L-theanine can really take the edge off in a
Yeah.
lot of ways.
And same thing with caffeine. Most of us don't consume, maybe Adderall or Vyvanse or Ritalin, but a lot of people do consume another type of stimulant on a daily basis. In fact, maybe sometimes multiple times a day. And so, if you have a lot of anxiety and your caffeine is contributing to that anxiety to some extent, using some L-theanine can really help to take the edge off of those stimulating properties of the caffeine. And nature actually figured this out before we did. But naturally, L-theanine is found in green and black tea. And so, generally, when you're consuming, if you consumed 200 milligrams of caffeine from say green tea or black tea, because of the natural L-theanine content, it's not going to be as stimulating. You're still going to get the focus effect, but you're not going to feel tense, on edge, irritable, anxious, as much as you would from say drinking green tea or black tea instead.
Yeah. So there's some grace in there.
There's some grace.
Now, that being said, I want to be clear. Are we advocating for caffeine use?
No, not necessarily.
and there's reasons for that we'll talk about in another episode. But suffice it to say that the weight of evidence related to mental health and caffeine use is that it actually is not beneficial, especially when people are drinking or taking high levels of caffeine. It can actually cause more anxiety. It can cause other issues. It reduces the blood flow to the brain. But again, L-theanine can help take the edge off some of those issues, but it's not going to erase some of the problems with caffeine.
So let's talk about a few studies in which they used L-theanine. So the first study we're going to talk about, it was an 8-week open label study in which 20 patients with depression and anxiety were administered 250 milligrams of L-theanine daily. The conclusion was that L-theanine was safe and has multiple beneficial effects on depressive symptoms, anxiety, sleep disturbance, and cognitive impairments in patients with major depression. So this is really cool because this particular study looked at kind of multiple different symptoms that people are experiencing, and how many of your patients, Dr. Binus, when they come in with depression, are also dealing with sleep issues and anxiety?
Right. I mean,
most of them, right?
It's very, very common. Those things often come as a constellation, and it's pretty amazing that they saw like, wow, this could really help all of those things, really.
So let's talk about the second study, Dr. Binus.
So there was a randomized placebo-controlled crossover and double-blind trial. So again, this is a well-designed study. L-theanine was superior to placebo in reducing stress-related responses, improving verbal fluency, and improving executive function, which I think is really interesting. And again, I think we don't always see those things go together. In other words, a lot of the times when there's a product like a medication that reduces a sense of stress and anxiety, it can even worsen the cognitive aspect. In other words, like verbal fluency and memory and this sort of thing. But here we see L-theanine, the opposite happening. It's like not only does it help stress, but it actually helps cognitively as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The last one, and this is another, I think, important study, in part because they use really healthy individuals. A lot of times studies include patients that aren't necessarily, medically very healthy, and so that does kind of strain some of the results. But in this one, they used fifth year pharmacy students who were stressed out about their long-term commitment to the pharmacy practice. And so in giving them L-theanine, it was able to suppress that initial stress response that they were having. It was far superior to placebo.
So did they all become pharmacists then?
I hope so, because we need more. So do we recommend supplementing with L-theanine for anxiety? Yeah, definitely. It's a strong yes. We included it in mindful relaxation because it's safe, effective, and it works quickly without causing excessive sedation. So, Dr. Binus, what would you give L-theanine as a score?
Probably an A+.
Yeah,
I mean, there's really not a downside.
There really isn't. There's I can't think of anybody really in which I wouldn't consider recommending L-theanine to. I've had so many patients that have taken L-theanine just on its own that have had really good results.
So if people are interested in finding out more about our product and maybe how to purchase it, where would they go?
For now, you can go to beautifulmindslabs.com. It is currently on there. There's some more information that you can read kind of about the product. And so that would be the best place to get it right now. In the near future, we're hoping to have that product also available on Amazon to make, it a little bit more accessible and easy for people to pick up. If you are a patient of ours, you can also pick it up in the office as well. So that is available to our patients.
All right. Well, thank you. We're excited to get this out there. And for us, of course, we're talking about this, we're promoting it. But the biggest piece and the biggest reason I'm excited about promoting this is because I see that it works. I mean, I see the difference really in so many patients that are coming back and saying, wow, yeah, this stuff really does make a difference. And to me, that's exciting because that's what our work is all about, is to really improve the quality of people's lives.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, Jonathan. And I hope all of you listeners found this interesting. And again, if you want more information, don't hesitate to go online and check out our website. And we're happy to give you all the content that we can to improve your beautiful mind.
Thanks for listening. To hear more episodes, find us on social media, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.